Ukraine didn't expect much from the UN General Assembly this week until President Zelensky met with Donald Trump on the sidelines of that summit. And then we saw a change in rhetoric from President Trump. He appeared to shift his tone on the conflict, saying that Russia was fighting aimlessly.
It's been a terrible war, it should have ended, and Russia should have stopped it. But they've been 3.5 years and they've gotten not so far. So we'll see what happens. But the other side can fight too, and they've proven that. Maybe it could be that Russia's a paper tiger.
Well, then he went on to social media and said that Kyiv could win all of Ukraine back in its original form. The Kremlin responded to that, saying this was erroneous. But this change in US rhetoric has yet to lead to a decisive change in policy. And then we had quite a familiar speech from President Zelensky at the UN that once again highlighted the country's need for more advanced weapons. So as NATO scrambles to strengthen its own defences following multiple airspace incursions, will international focus return back to the front lines in Ukraine? Our BBC experts are here to answer all of that and plenty more.
I'm Vitaly Shevchenko.
I'm Paul Kirby.
And I'm Lucy Hockings. Welcome to Ukrainecast.
Ukrainecast from BBC News.
We've had some great questions in from you, and we're going to be getting to those in a bit. But first, we need to talk about this whirlwind couple of days we've had at the UN General Assembly. But before we do that, Vitaly, we need to introduce Paul and welcome him to the Ukrainecast family. Paul Kirby, who is our Europe digital editor and pretty important person in this building, Vitaly.
I think he's one of the most important people in the building when it comes to Russia and Ukraine coverage, because most articles about Russia or Ukraine that you see on the BBC website, they pass through your hands and are seen by your eyes. Is that right, Paul?
Including many by you, it would have to be said, Vitaly, yes.
Yes, we do work.
We've made
together.
Paul blush, but we are so happy to have you with us, Paul. These paper tiger comments that we saw from President Trump, were you surprised to see him attacking Russia in this way?
I think it's as far as he's ever gone in criticising Russia. And I think a lot of people have noticed that. But what does it really mean? Does it mean anything at all? Is it just rhetoric? And I think most people have come to the conclusion that, wow, it's quite a comment, and it's really upset the Russians as well, I think. But ultimately, it doesn't mean a great deal. Some people have been quite surprised that he used words that have been used in the past by Mao Zedong and Khrushchev, the former Soviet leader. Slightly odd, but it basically means he thinks the Russians are toothless. They're not. And it's insulting. But does it mean anything beyond that? I'm not so sure.
And when he says that Ukraine can take back all of its territory and maybe even more, he doesn't say how exactly and who's going to help Ukraine. He mentions Europe, kind of suggesting, OK, if Europe buys you or NATO buys you enough weapons, then yeah, you can do it. He doesn't say that the United States has changed or is going to change its attitude and will restart supplying weapons to Ukraine.
I mean, do you think he just misspoke when he talked about taking back original borders, but then maybe even further than that? You sometimes wonder with Trump if...
Yeah, exactly. Is he actually saying anything significant here? And does he go as far as talking about Crimea? And probably not. But as Vitaly says, the reality is that how is Ukraine going to recoup all this territory, 20% of its entire territory that's currently under occupation? That seems unlikely. You get the feeling here that despite all the words from Zelensky and Macron being very warm and welcoming about this apparent volte-face, this turnabout in his rhetoric, you get the sense that nothing's really changed and he's trying to wash his hands of it.
And is there also a concern, Paul, that he might say something different in a few days' time?
Yeah, always. Yeah. And one of the things that people have pointed out, including, I have to say, the Russians, is that he has just been speaking to Zelensky. And one of the criticisms is that Donald Trump might just be responding to the person
the last person he spoke to.
Exactly. And it's fair to say that although Zelensky was one of the last people he spoke to, the other one was Ursula von der Leyen, the European Commission president. So if you've got both of them speaking to Trump just beforehand, that might make a difference.
And notably, immediately before meeting Donald Trump, Zelensky said that Ukraine had recaptured 360 square kilometers of its land in the east. So maybe that's the kind of the message that Trump got from Zelensky, and he's repeating it.
We should throw into the mix that he also had a meeting with President Macron as well. But what about the Russian response? Were they offended, Vitaly?
The Russians are still trying to stay on friendly terms with Donald Trump. Dmitry Peskov, the spokesman for Vladimir Putin, he said, well, Russia is normally called a bear. We're not a tiger, and there's no such thing as a paper bear. And I thought he gently dismissed these allegations that the Russian economy is struggling, that the war is pointless. But yet again, he said, we're thankful to Donald Trump for leading this effort to restart the peace process. So the Kremlin is still trying to be friends with the Donald.
Paul, there was one other meeting that could have been significant between Sergei Lavrov and Marco Rubio. What do we know about that meeting? Because not much seems to have come out about it.
Exactly. There was very little. The talks lasted about an hour, and clearly nothing came of it. Now, does that mean nothing came of it and they left, both of them in a huff? Because you get the sense that that might be the case. Does that mean that they've run out of things to say to each other? That also might be the case. Again, it might be the sense that Trump's moving on. Trump's had enough of this. And Rubio said something very interesting very recently. While everybody was being quite positive about Trump's turnabout, it was Rubio that pointed out nothing is going to be done militarily to change the situation on the ground, which made the point that this has to be sorted out by negotiation, and we're nowhere near that.
So we should maybe be reading more, Vitaly, into the comments from the Vice President, from J.D. Vance, who said if the Russians refuse to negotiate in good faith, I think it's going to be very, very bad for that country. That's what the President has made clear.
I would argue that maybe we should be reading their comments less, because we've had so many and they've led to nothing. I know that words are the currency in which we journalists trade and in which politicians trade. But to carry any weight, they need to be backed up by hard commodities, something you can actually touch, something tangible. And when these words are not backed up with action, they lose their meaning.
And also, Paul, actually listening to President Trump, one of the things I noticed, he really was batting the ball back into Europe's court in his speech.
Yes.
It's almost he's pulling back. I wondered if he was bored of the situation or whatever, but he's definitely saying, Europe, you need to step up and take over.
You go back to August when Vitaly, you and many others went to Alaska following the presidents, Trump and Putin. We've sort of come full circle. And I remember, immediately after that, the European leaders rushed to Washington to try to deter Trump from going further than they wanted to. And you get the sense that we've come back to that point where Europe is basically as it was, with von der Leyen very much holding Trump's ear at the moment. I think she has a perspective on the war that Trump listens to now. And I think she won't be dissatisfied with the position that we're in right now, but the ball is very much in Europe's court, and Trump is talking, for example, about it's Europe's turn to turn the gas pipes off, to stop the flow of oil that's coming from Russia. In terms of oil to Hungary and Slovakia, but in terms of gas, liquefied natural gas, that's going to several other European countries. I think Trump's making that point that it's Europe's turn now to fulfill that.
Well, we then did at the UN hear from President Zelensky, and it was a familiar pitch from him. There were a few new things in there, but the key thing that came out once again, weapons, weapons, weapons.
If a nation wants peace, it still has to work on weapons. You know perfectly well international law doesn't work fully unless you have powerful friends who are truly willing to stand up for it. And even that doesn't work without weapons. It's terrible, but without it, things would be even worse. There are no security guarantees except friends and weapons.
That's quite a line, isn't it, from Zelensky and the speechwriters? There are no security guarantees except friends and weapons. Do you think, Paul, he is trying to sort of seize the momentum here again around this?
But again, we go back to what the US, what Donald Trump was saying. The flow of weapons is fine if it's coming from Europe and if it's coming from NATO. And it's fine if they're buying American weapons, but the US is not supplying the weapons in the way that it used to. And that, I think, was his message over the past few weeks, and he's reiterated that.
I think his rhetoric has changed slightly in that he's moved on from appealing just to the sense of charity, goodwill, a sense of what's the right thing to do. And now he is appealing a bit more to slightly more down-to-earth, selfish interests of Ukraine's allies and potential allies. And what he's been saying since the drone incursion into Poland and the 3 MiGs over Estonia is that, well, I told you, Russia is not going to stop in Ukraine. Now it's testing you on your territory. And as he said at the UN, it's cheaper to start fighting that kind of expansionism now in Ukraine than trying to stop Russia in your own territory.
So there was this big diplomatic frenzy that we have seen at the UN in New York, and it's hot on the heels of what NATO allies are considering a significant escalation, this Russian incursion, first into Polish and then into Estonian airspace. We've had lots of interest from you on this, so let's get a question.
Hello, Ukrainecast. My name is Paul, and this is my question. Russia regularly uses false excuses and outright denial to conceal its involvement. For example, Russian officials denied responsibility for drones over Poland, claiming there was no proof they were Russian. Why can't NATO or bordering states use the same playbook? Why not shoot down drones, rockets, while they are still over Ukrainian territory? Then simply deny involvement, just as Russia does.
Paul.
Interesting, this one, isn't it? Yeah. We don't have the same playbook in the West that Russia uses. And NATO has its rules. That's simply it. It's a tricky one because they're all having to deal with this. Right now, the Danes are having to deal with this. All these incursions that come from, we assume, Russia, but they're not saying so. So first of all, you've got Poland and Estonia, but you've got several other Western nations all on the eastern flank bordering Russia. So all the Baltics, Poland, Romania, Bulgaria, Norway, they're all having to deal with this, but they all have to adopt the same rules. And I think that's the problem here.
And it's fair to say they're more risk averse as well in NATO.
Oh, incredibly more risk averse. It's a fear that Vladimir Putin is almost completely free of. He's not afraid to escalate. But coming back to Paul's question, I think there's a practical and a more political strategic dimension to it. In practical terms, if NATO were to fire missiles into Ukraine, I'm sure Russia will notice that. So that's not necessarily going to fool anyone if NATO said, well, it's not us. In more strategic terms, when people are doing things secretly, it's usually because they are not sure it's the right thing to do, or they're afraid of consequences. So when we are discussing why isn't NATO doing that, we need to talk, or NATO needs to decide why exactly it is not sure it's the right thing to do, and what kind of consequences it's afraid if it's seen shooting down Russian drones over Ukraine.
Well, Leon has also been in touch with us, and he's really interested in the sort of decision-making process that goes on in situations like this.
Hello, Ukrainecast. This is Leon from the Netherlands, and I have the following question. Where is the line between a routine interception, like escorting the Russian aircraft, and an escalating military response, such as forcing a landing or shooting down a plane? What factors determine whether such an action is considered self-defense under Article 5 of the NATO Treaty? Thanks for answering.
Thanks for your question, Leon. Vitaly?
So this was more or less a routine intercept as far as past practice is concerned. So the way it happened, I understand, is that 2 Italian F-35 fighter jets were scrambled to fly alongside the 3 Russian MiG jets. And they rocked their wings to show that, well, look, you're not supposed to be here, because the Russians were not responding to attempts at radio contact. So rocking the wings was probably the only way to pass on a message. The Russians rocked their wings in response and continued flying. And they were there for 12 minutes, which is a long time compared to what happened in Turkey, for example, in 2015, when a Russian fighter jet was shot down after 17 seconds. The NATO chief, Mark Rutte, of course, he was asked about why did he shoot those planes down. And he said, we carried out an assessment of risk, and we determined that those planes did not pose enough of a risk. They were armed with air-to-air missiles, so they couldn't fire anything powerful at potential targets on the ground. Now, it's also important to remember that when Russia does this, it always seems to leave a door open for uncertainty.
Ambiguity.
Doubt. Was this a mistake? Remember, we discussed the Polish drone incursion. Almost 20 drones, possibly more than 20 drones. Was that a mistake? Russia just lost them, maybe? That is the point. That is the plan. Russia is testing NATO responses, trying to find out what is the point at which NATO will say, that's it, we're taking action now.
Well, it's all about interpretation, isn't it? And people and countries see things differently. And that is the subject of this next question that we have from Stuart.
Hello, Ukrainecast. If one looks at the map issued by the Estonian MOD, which shows the alleged flight path of 3 MiG-31s that are said to have entered Estonian airspace, the aircraft merely clipped the corner of a zigzag border. Is NATO making a fuss over nothing, and is it Russia's aim to engineer such a fuss so that she may paint NATO as being aggressive towards her?
That's a difficult one, but it follows on from the previous one. Vitaly made the point that these planes were in Estonian and therefore NATO airspace for 12 minutes. Now, maybe they were clipping the border of Estonian airspace, but they were only a handful of minutes away from Tallinn. Estonia is a small country and it has no air force, and it is quite clear that the Russians, as Vitaly says, are testing NATO's air defences to see just how far they can go before anything will happen. So it's far more than making a fuss. The question is whether Russia would listen to Mark Rutte saying, stop doing this. In other words, what he said was, this must stop. But it's difficult to imagine that Russia will stop doing this, because it is, on many occasions in the past few months, testing NATO's air defences. And that really, this Estonian issue was probably one of the most serious that it's had, despite all these mini air incursions over the years. They've been doing this thing over the Baltic, for example, but actually over Estonian airspace, that's quite serious.
And this feeling of ambiguity and uncertainty, it leads everyone to blame Russia whenever something happens and it's not clear who did it. For example, these drones flying all over Denmark. Mm-hmm.
Yes, which is just extraordinary, because the problems the Danes have is that they're not causing any harm, and yet they're a threat. It's a serious escalation. We don't know for sure it's the Russians. The Danes are not saying it's the Russians, although they haven't ruled that out. The reason they haven't said for sure it's Russia is because there's no concrete evidence. They haven't shot them down. There aren't any to look at. So what do you do next? The answer for the Danes is not to shoot them down, because they don't want to harm their own people. But do they try? And it also shows that the Danish air defences are vulnerable to anything that comes under the radar, like these drones. So they need to invest heavily, in a way that they have not been doing, in targeting, combating drone warfare. And I have to say, the solution for many countries on the eastern flank is basically ask the Ukrainians, because they've been dealing with this for 3.5 years, increasingly so, more than ever now.
We're going to stick with NATO and a question from another Paul, and it's a question that we're often asked here on Ukrainecast.
Hello, Ukrainecast. This is Paul in Ipswich. Russia didn't want Finland or Sweden to join NATO, but they joined nonetheless, and Putin did nothing. What do you think Putin would do if NATO were to put its reservations to one side and admit Ukraine? What could Putin do that he isn't doing already, and short of going nuclear, which would constitute a direct attack on NATO with the obvious consequences? Thank you.
We've got an abundance of Pauls today, so I think, Paul, you should pick up
Paul's
this one.
welcome, I have to
Yes.
say. Yes, this is a tricky question that surfaced throughout the war, really. And I think Ukraine can't join NATO simply because Ukraine is a country at war, and it's an unwritten rule for NATO that no country that has currently got a conflict going on within its borders is allowed to join in. So it's not going to happen. Will it happen in the future? There's no indication that there's any chance of it. And it's a red line for Russia. Therefore, probably the rest of NATO will not accept it.
I mean, Jens Stoltenberg, the former NATO chief, did once say that they could join in the long term, but not until after the war has ended. We're going to finish with something completely different, and it's a question that's a bit more left field, but it comes from one of our young viewers and listeners, Thomas.
Hello, Ukrainecast. This is Thomas. Given that Charlie Kirk was assassinated and someone was recently found guilty of attempting to kill Trump, I was wondering if Vladimir Putin has ever faced any assassination attempts.
I love it when our young viewers and listeners get in touch because they sometimes think of things that we haven't considered, Vitaly. But I think quite a few people are interested to know what's been happening with President Putin and whether there have been these attempts on his life.
I'm sure there have been, because clearly he's got a lot of enemies. However, I'm not aware of any instance where his ear got clipped by a bullet, or somebody fired a bullet at him, or there was an explosion. There have been numerous occasions when the police raided a flat and found a rifle with a scope or some explosives and said they were preparing to target Vladimir Putin. There were instances when his helicopter got close to some Ukrainian drones over Kursk, I think. Ukrainian drones targeted the Kremlin back in 2023, although I don't think Putin was actually there at the time. So Vladimir Putin has a lot of reasons to be really careful with his security.
He's really careful and he's really paranoid.
I encourage Thomas and all of our viewers, when they next see Vladimir Putin speaking at a news conference, have a look at his desk, and there will be a mug or a glass of water or a flask. It will be covered. It's always covered. There are always rumors about his security, about how he tries to send potential attackers on a false trail by pretending to leave a city, like when he was in Sochi. His motorcade left, his helicopter left, but he was there in Sochi all the time. And there are numerous other examples like that, but not examples of someone actually putting out a gun and firing at him.
Any other stories or examples that you've heard, Paul?
I think there are legends that probably aren't true about Putin and body doubles, but we'll never really know. But it is very interesting how, I remember seeing his motorcade going through Moscow at the very beginning of his presidency, when, his bodyguard was really much smaller than it is now, and even then security was tight. But then he created his own personal guard, the Rosgvardia, which is enormous. And nobody, I think, in terms of world leaders, has invested so heavily in ensuring his own security as Mr. Putin.
Speaking of cars, I've seen identical presidential limousines with identical number plates, which is illegal under Russian law. Not that it's not been done in other countries like the United States, but that's what he uses. Which car am I going to be in? Nobody knows.
It's endlessly fascinating. Vitaly, thank you. Paul, thank you. And thanks so much to you for watching. We'll be back with another Q&A episode next week. But in the meantime, why don't you check out the Ukrainecast feed, wherever you get your BBC podcasts, for plenty more analysis. See you next week. Bye-bye.